Okay. Wow, look at the size of this group. This must be, I'm assuming this is a topic that I've hit the button on. This is good. It is, in advance, I'll tell you, it's not the most uplifting period of Jewish history. The other thing, just this little housekeeping, is it's 5 weeks. Next week there is no class because next week is Yom Limud. We have the community-wide Jewish learning, and that'll be at Beth Yeshurun. And so, what's that? Is it Beth Israel? My bad. Don't go to Beth Yeshurun, go to Beth Israel. All right. I brought the wrong glasses. Hopefully I can see something here. I do need 30 seconds. I got to switch my glasses. Oh, there are words on the page. Yeah, there you go. All right, my friends. So we're on recording. We're again, all the 5 sessions will be on YouTube, so should you miss something, it'll be online. I think if you go there, all my other classes from the past that were here in the sanctuary also can be found. If you really want to torture yourself and listen to me more, go for it. The Middle Ages really are a period of constant movement, not by choice. We are thrown out, Jews are thrown out of one country after another, England in 1290, France in 1305, and then they're welcomed back and they're thrown out again in the 1390s. They're thrown out of Austria, they're thrown out of one country after another. But the expulsion of the Jews from Spain, after a millennium and a half of settlement in that country, is a liminal moment in Jewish history. Sheer numbers alone make it different than everything else. The expulsion is connected to the names and the domestic policies of Ferdinand and Isabella of Columbus fame. Okay, so when again, as I said in my last class, most people, when you say 1492, what you think of is Columbus sailing the ocean blue. For Jews who have a sense of history, 1492 is one of the most destructive and horrible dates in our history. As a matter of fact, a number of the people who went on Columbus's boat, it's not random, converted in the day or two before his boat left and were on that boat with him because they were fleeing. They had to go somewhere. All right. So Ferdinand and Isabella get married in 1469, and it brings together the fulfillment of the uniting of Aragon and Castile, and it begins the calamity that will befall the Jews. That period from 1469, the wedding, the final expression is with the conquering of the Muslim nations, the Muslim community of Granada, and then the expulsion of all Jews in 1492. What we're going to cover today, I do have more, is the period all the way through the 1480s. What I'm going to do in here, I know the title was missing, the class was missing a part of it. It's the expulsion, the antecedents. In other words, that which happened before that led up to it, and then also what happens after. The first half of it seemed gotten left off on the title. All right, but I am going to give you some background here. In the previous centuries, Jews had been recruited to numerous countries, Christian countries, in an attempt to repopulate and reconstruct what were newly conquered territories. As the Christians moved into communities, They needed people to, and they conquered people and threw them out. They needed someone to work the land. And the leaders of those lands would often invite Jews to come. They'd give them all sorts of gifts. They'd give them land. They'd give them this and that and the other thing, and welcome them in. All right. Each milestone in those battles against the Muslims set off new waves of immigration into Christian Spain, where Christian kings were taking advantage of political concessions to induce Jews to come there. All right? Jews were given houses, they were given land, all that had been vacated by the fleeing Muslims. They were given abandoned agricultural properties, and as individuals and as groups as Jews in the collective. At the same time, Christianity at this point is getting more and more centralized and more powerful. So on the one hand, the local leaders are inviting the Jews in to Spain. At the same time, Western Christendom is reviewing what its perspective on the Jews really is. I have one for you here. Here they are. Okay. So what you've got Christian knights and clerics streaming into Spain from France, because they're going into the new Muslim communities, to join the battle, and with it, they bring anti-Semitism that was rooted in Northern Europe. And so you have mounting missionary zeal to convert the Jews, and it's accompanied by legislation against the Jews to try and make life as difficult as possible so that they will convert. Right? Not a new idea, all right? Jews enter the Christian towns of Spain, and they're often initially given charters by the leaders of the community that protects them. They're told nobody can hurt them, nobody can do this, etc. However, they're only partially successful, because at this point in time, the Pope has only so much influence, and the leaders only have so much influence. I mentioned this, I apologize in my last class. I apologize for any repetition from my introduction to Judaism class. At this point, you have to realize there's always three groups that have concerns. You've got the religious leader, represented by the Pope. You've got the political leaders who want the Jews there because they bring an economic benefit, but the large population wants nothing to do with them. They're economic competition. What you're going to hear, anyone who's ever taken a course with me on the history of anti-Semitism, is anytime anti-Semitism appears, it always has, obviously, a religious element to it, and I don't want to downplay that at all. But there's always an economic underpinning. Always. All right? Nobody wants immigrants, right? This is not a new issue here in America. The Jews were essentially the outsiders, and they're competing for jobs. So no matter what the political leaders want, no matter what the Pope's goals are, the people don't want them. All right, and so you have the rabbis also starting to pick this up. And so they start issuing decrees to the Jewish community saying, you need not to provoke. Jews are not going to gamble. Jews are not going to visit brothels. Jews are going to wear clothing that is not too bright and too attractive and too whatever. Don't put it in the face of the people who are trying to harm us. Don't provoke. So the rabbis themselves are offering tools of survival. So that's the larger environment. You can see it's not delightful. As I said, this is a course that's not uplifting. And then the Black Death. The Black Death happens, 1347 to 1353, a period of about 8 years. It has a catastrophic effect on Jewish communities across Europe, and for Jews, not just because of the disease, but by the follow-up that happens as well. Jews are dying from the plague almost in the same percentage as everybody else. We're talking about a plague, as I mentioned, that eliminates between 30 and 60% of the European population, and Spain in particular. So if you were to equivalent, COVID is a toy in comparison. We're talking about an experience that if it were to happen today in America, you'd lose between 110 and 220 million people. That's the equivalent. COVID is inconsequential relatively. Right? And so what happens is Jews are dying, and at the same time that they're dying, they become scapegoats in a process of people looking for an explanation. We're not talking about a scientific world in the 1400s. We're talking about people who have no idea what's really going on and need some explanation. All right, so got it. As I mentioned to you, the Jewish population suffers similar losses, but what really happens here, we now know scientifically what happened. Okay, we know that it was a bacteria that was carried by a black rat, transmitted by a flea that jumped from the animal, from the rat to human beings. And oftentimes, how did it spread? This is a new world of shipping. You know, here's my humor, when they were on ships, it wasn't Royal Caribbean. Okay, we're talking about really poor quality, poor health, poor everything, where everything would spread. They'd pull into town and suddenly people would die. Now, they had no idea what was going on. They had no idea how to make sense of the causation of what was happening here. And so as a result, the Jews who were already a vulnerable minority because of everything that's happened over the last 120, 200 years are scapegoated and blamed for deliberately spreading the disease. A particular accusation was that the Jews were poisoning the wells and the food supplies to spread disease and to destroy Christian civilization. That was the goal, quote unquote, of the Jews. Many Jewish communities are completely destroyed by the mobs. And in process, there's fear and prejudice, and everything just turns violent. Jews are rounded up. They are tortured into confessing to what they didn't do, and as a result, they're then massacred. This is a pattern you probably have heard from other events in Jewish history. In Valencia, 250 Jews are killed. Barcelona, 400 Jews are killed. Strasbourg, Valentine's Day, 1349, the burning alive of 2,000 Jews. And while, again, remember what I said to you about economic? While these Jews are being killed, the local community is taking their homes. They're moving in. Okay? There's always an economic underpinning. And many of the Jews, as a result, saw what was coming and they committed mass suicide as opposed to being beaten to death by the mobs. Some authorities, including Pope Clement VI, condemned the violence, and he issues 2 papal bulls affirming Jewish innocence. He stated the following. He says, this is from the Pope's words, "It cannot be true that the Jews, by such a heinous crime, are the cause or occasion of the plague, because through many parts of the world, the same plague, by the hidden judgment of God, has afflicted and afflicts the Jews themselves and many races who have never lived alongside them." Communities where there are no Jews, it's happening. These are the words of the Pope. Ineffective, but well-intended. All right? So as a result, they're ignored. Their influence was limited, and their attempts to protect the Jews was often futile. Where there were some communities where there was some success, but that's a case of the exception speaking to the rule. And so growing fear and mistrust, what do you do with the people you believe is doing this? 1, you kill them. 2, where you don't kill them, you put them into ghettos. You put them into communities to separate them because they represent that which is vile. Surviving populations migrate to more welcome regions, and many of them end up, and this is where you see the beginning of the Polish and Lithuanian Jewish communities. They go there. The King Casimir III of Poland enthusiastically gives refuge and protection to the Jews who want to come there. It's consistent with his previous behavior. He has interest in tapping the economic potential of the Jews. And so you have there, as they're fleeing from this situation in the 1300s, you have the creation of communities in Poland that flourish for centuries. Of course, that's not where it ends. Or that's the end of the course and we're done. By the middle of the 1300s, things again get further deteriorate. In 1370, about 30 years after the plague, a prelate in Seville by the name of Ferrant Martinez, launches a campaign against the Jewish community of Spain, calling the issue a Jewish problem that needs to be solved. He calls for the destruction of all 23 synagogues in Seville and for the confinement of all Jews to a ghetto. He believes that if he can eliminate the cessation of contact between the Jews and the Christians, the taint that lies with the Jews will go away. That's his hope. And it's not limited, as I mentioned before, to personal relationships, but to business relationships as well. He clamors as well for the removal of Jews from all positions of authority. There had been a period where they were able to get into positions. That is gone, because they were under Muslim rule. He gets rid of any Jews in any government position. 1390, he's somewhat controlled during this time because there's a bishop who's sort of putting a squasher on him to some degree. The local king is also putting a squasher. He's doing it anyway, but there's some lack of control here. Unfortunately, the archbishop and the king of Castile both die. The king is replaced by an infant, so you know how that plays. And his activities become more ominous, and they grab the attention of the larger population as well, fellow Christians. And so a feeling of unrest, a real transition is permeating the atmosphere. The advent of Lent, with its reminders of the Passion event, serve as a pretext for a series of horrible, inflammatory sermons by this Martinez character, and he keys the popular population to a peak of just absolute hatred. Ash Wednesday, March 15, 1391, a crowd breaks into the Jewish quarter of Seville. The civic authorities initially take some of the ringleaders and they arrest them, but that only serves to further the fervor of everybody around them. They see that as an attack on them. After some further disturbances, there's some order restored, but the spirit of unrest is still there, and they continue to hear from this Martinez character every place he goes, every pulpit he stands on, about the horrors that are innate within Judaism. On June 4th, 1391, all right, about 3 months after Ash Wednesday, his long defamation results in a mob that could no longer be constrained, and you have this orgy of carnage that occurs in Seville. The Jewish community is given the option of conversion or death. There's no third choice. They're not even being given the option of leaving. Hundreds of Jews are murdered in their homes inside. Countless more, as many as 5,000, are murdered on the street. Jewish women and children are captured and sold into slavery. And of those who survived and remained, they're only able to save their lives by being baptized. Reading number 1 on your sheet. And because I have the mic, I'm going to do the reading. I apologize, but there's people online, and I want them to be able to hear. Okay? On the day, this is right by Rabbi Hasdai Kreskis. On the day of the new moon of the fierce and impetuous month of Tammuz, God drew back the bows of the enemy against the great community of Seville, whose population ranged from 6,000 to 7,000 families. They set her gates afire and killed a great number of people. The majority, however, converted. Some, including children and women, were sold to the Muslims as slaves. The streets of the Jews became desolate. Many died having sanctified his name. In other words, they committed suicide. Many have profaned the Holy Covenant. In other words, they converted. These pogroms spread from Seville across Spain. Jews are given the same choice: convert or die. We don't know exact numbers. The Spain had somewhere between 300 and 500,000 Jews. It's significant in those days. All right, significant. One of the professors I had, the gentleman who came here last year, Dean Bell, describes European Jewry in most places. When you're talking about a community of Jews, you don't have enough people to get a minyan. They were small little dots of people here and there. This is significant. This is where the Jews were. This is New York. Okay? This is the United States versus the rest of the world. This is where the Jews are. According to tradition, obviously the numbers are rounded off in some way, 100,000 Jews convert, another 100,000 Jews are murdered, and the same number survive by fleeing or hiding. Many of those who do survive, how do they do so? They pay their neighbors to keep their mouths shut and they hide there. Many of the others do the same thing and the neighbors turn them in anyway. In a year's time, what happens is you have a community in Spain, the Jews, that are mourning what was essentially a very prosperous, free time in Jewish history. Other than American life today, or being in Israel at the time or now or then, there's been no other place in history where Jews were more free to live their lives than Spain during the golden ages of Spain's time. You're seeing a people saying, looking at that and saying, I lost it. We've lost it all. Again, the idea, I want to emphasize the difficulty when you're told you're going to be expelled. Think about what this means for your life. Business, gone. The likelihood of seeing the people in your community, your extended family, gone. Families who've been buried, opportunity to visit cemeteries, zero. It is not easy to get up and leave. We can look back on Germany and say, what was wrong with the people? But it's not easy to just pick up and leave. You can't just assume, of course that's the choice. Hindsight's perfect. Hindsight is perfect. And so you've got, and on top of that, those who stay, the synagogues have been destroyed. There's no central place to go to congregate. And if you do, it's dangerous to do so. And so you have a psychological destruction of the community that's just as powerful and profound as the physical. The community that's still there has to contend with the large losses of people that are just gone, and they have to decide how to handle the conversions of people whom they were neighbors and friends with who are now the enemy, part of the group that's trying to destroy their lives. You have to contend with, what about those people who want to come back? What do we do with them? And there are all sorts of rabbinic discussions. Rashi ultimately rules that, yes, we can welcome them back. As before, Rashi ruled before that. But they use his ruling to welcome most of them back. But what do? It's not a clear cut. Somebody who just rejected everything you stand for and now wants to come back, okay, well, are they real? What's their motivation? So you have all these psychological barriers to health that are going on. And then people continue to convert over the next 50 or 100 years. They say that by 1415, another 50,000 Jews are converted. And they're influenced by a number of things. Prior to 1391, a rabbi of Burgos by the name of Solomon Halevi converted, and he converted his entire family in process. He became a patron of Benedict the 13th, who was not the Pope, but I guess in a sense the anti-Pope. In Spain, they kind of had their own little Pope for a while. Okay? I probably have trivialized it, but I don't know how else to express it. And eventually, this Halevi becomes the Bishop of Burgos in Castile, and he writes a whole series of polemic attacks on Judaism. It's work that influences anti-Semitism throughout the peninsula and furthers conversion throughout. One of the converts of Halevi was a former student of his by the name of Joshua al-Lorki, who is known to be a brilliant scholar, but he changes in so doing. He becomes a brilliant scholar of Christian theology. He takes on the name of Geronimo de Santa Fe to reflect his new devotion to his religion, and he writes a scathing and damaging attack on the Talmud. A writing by an unknown person at the same time is reading number 2. Please follow me here. In the year 5172, equivalent to 1412, the sky above Israel became dark, because there arose in Rome a pope who did everything in his power to force the Jews to convert and impose very harsh decrees on them. So again, the key fact here is popes vary too in how they approach the Jews. Right? The previous pope was much more open. This pope is not. All right? The Queen of Spain joined with the pope in this, and the Jews were driven from their homes by the sword. They were in terrible straits, to the extent that 16,000 Jews left the fold. Many, though, sanctified God's name and were burned to death, while others were killed by torture. Some fled into the fields. A few saved themselves by giving away all their possessions to wayfarers and to the peoples of the village. It's so easy. You know, if we were reading this about the 1940s, it would impact you much deeper. The problem is this distance of time, and so you hear this and you go, of course, whatever. I want to emphasize just how liminal this was in Jewish history. This was critical. This is the destruction of the main group of Jews. A new anti-Semitic pope, 1415, is in place, and so de Santa Fe organizes a disputation in Tortosa, which is on the coast just south of Barcelona. It is the dispute. Let me talk about what a disputation. Sometimes they're called debates. What's a debate? Two sides come together, and they take the merits of their arguments and they present them. And some, based on the quality of the presentation of the debates, someone reaches a conclusion or not. That's not what's going on here. Let me be clear. This is asymmetrical. This is Jews who take a risk anytime they say something positive about Judaism, regardless of their arguments. This is an atmosphere that is intimidating, with the Pope presiding and the risk of mob violence if you don't say the right thing. But it's a public debate in name. This one in particular lasted 21 months. It's the longest of all the debates that happened, and you can imagine many Jews convert afterwards because they realize what's coming. Again, they're reading the writing on the wall. The demoralization of those forced to participate in the debates leads to the conversions, and to further demoralize the remaining Jews, they attempt to convert the entire population. The crown then turns around and says, "I've got a whole bunch of new laws," effectively minimizing the ability to live freely here on the Iberian Peninsula. Jews are not allowed to flee Spain. That's rule number one. You can't leave during this time. And they're left with few options to live their lives as Jews. They're ordered to live apart in different communities on their own, although for Jews, because we all wanted to live near a synagogue, walking distance historically, there was a tendency to do that anyway. They were given, when they were put into the ghettos, because they weren't, when I say this, they may have been living in small little areas themselves. That's not where they're put. They're moved into the poorest part of town and told, you have 8 days to repair this ghetto and make it look good, or we're taking it away from you and you'll have no place to live. They were prohibited from practicing medicine, surgery, chemistry, and many of them were doctors. So this really impacted a large part of the population. Jews have been doctors for years. This left them without livelihood and condemns the population in general, with all the limitations on economic opportunities, to lives of poverty. They are forbidden from dealing in bread and wine and flour and meat. It closes off all the trades that they have as sources of revenue. The final orders prevent them from engaging in handicrafts or any kind of trade of any sort, and prohibits them from doing money lending. Okay, now go live in this little area, and good luck to you. They weren't allowed, also for those who might still have had a few dollars left, they weren't allowed to hire Christian servants, farmhands, grave diggers, or lamplighters. Lamplighters may seem insignificant, except what do you do on Shabbat? Right? If you can't light the flames yourself, okay, you've got issues. To curb any potential relationships and fellowship between the two communities, Jews were not allowed to eat, drink, or bathe with the Christians. Even a conversation, a visitation, or the exchanging of gifts was forbidden. Taxes, Jew taxes. Everybody pays their government taxes, and then you pay the extra Jew tax. Let's throw another 20% on because you're Jewish. And that required royal permission, and with it came the fact that now the Jewish communities who had self-regulated to some extent, they'd been allowed to use Jewish law to their courts and everything else, that's been removed. They can now have no governing bodies of any kind within the Jewish community. And so to say that they're relegated to a second class is a joke. There's a fourth class or a fifth class, I don't even know what you call it. To ensure that they understood their new position in society. Because we want to make sure the Jews know where they stand. They are prohibited from carrying the title of Don, in Spain this is significant, from carrying any arms at all in a society that is armed, or to trim their hair or beards, which makes them look distinct. Women are also forced to conform. They didn't have beards. They were required to wear plain, long mantles of coarse material that went all the way to their feet. And all of these laws are enforced by steep fines against the people that has no income. Those who broke the law were flogged. You can begin to understand why many of them converted, particularly when they're not allowed to flee. Unable to leave, unable to support themselves, they are being condemned to a life of poverty and suffering. Now, let me open up any comments or thoughts. All right, everybody's still asleep. So the answer, I mean, there's no way to really know, but it's approximately a third. As I said before, about a third converted, a third died, were killed, and a third fled. It's not an exact number, though. I say a third. It could be 30, 25, 20. They don't really know. The record keeping wasn't like it is today. Okay? The community came together. The community basically came together and just made sure everybody had, a piece of bread. There's no easy answer to that question. How do you survive in poverty? Right. I didn't expect you to have an answer. You're next. This is in the mid-1300s. Mid-1300s, early 1400s. Yes, ma'am. You're next.
There were families that, in which some converted, some did not, and they still had relations back and forth. I mean, they were uneasy.
Yeah. So the question, just for those online, is, or the comment is that there were families that were split. Some of them converted and some didn't. And it affected the way they interacted, although at a later point it actually serves the trade business in a particularly odd way. But yes, families are split over this too.
Also the question of belief, not all of the ones who converted necessarily.
Yeah, right. The vast majority are being forced to convert, and therefore there's some question in that, as to the veracity of their intent, and that leads to the Inquisition ultimately. Yeah.
Were they allowed to, since they couldn't sell bread, they couldn't sell food, where did they get it? Were they allowed to interact with Christians?
No, so they're not allowed to interact. I have to imagine, like anything else, a black market developed. That's what happens in history. So I'm projecting from other situations to this. Yes. So initially when they convert, the answer is yes. Now they are full Christians with all the rights of Christians, and you'll see how that plays out very negatively. Yes.
I've heard that there were some families that kept up the Jewish tradition secretly, even after the Inquisition, all the way throughout history to this day. What percentage of those do you think were among the converts?
All right, so again, the question is, we know people who converted but practiced Judaism secretly, and how has that played out over the generations years later? We don't know numbers. I can't give you a percentage, I can't give you a number. I can validate the fact that yes, you're correct. And actually, a friend of mine, her son married somebody who was deemed themselves to be a converso. All right, went through conversion just to avoid any problems with children per se, but they found in their history, Rabbi asked this last night. I was talking to him, and he said to me, yeah, there are families that'll discover, they have this tradition of going down in the basement on Friday afternoons and lighting 2 candles. No one knows why. Right? Well, there's probably some connection here historically. Yes, sir. The answer is I should know. I believe they were somewhere around 10 to 20 million people in Spain at the time. So figure 500,000. So 5 into 1 million is a half, and out of 20 is 1/20 times 1/2. It's 1. Okay, it's significant though. I mean, it's certainly far greater than the percentage of Jews in Houston. Far greater. Yes. Got the land and the what? Yeah. Well, again, so yes, so just the question is about the homes and the land that we received as the Muslims were fleeing, and we were given these homes and lands. Did it lead to resentment in the larger population? Absolutely, absolutely. Yes, sir. Okay, why did it not convert the Muslims? All right, let's look at sheer numbers, okay? Again, you're talking about 2 extremely large communities, the Christians and the Muslims. The Jews had no power. The Muslims have lots of power. The Muslims were defeated in battle, but they weren't going down quietly. The Jews were this small little group that had no power anywhere. They didn't have a land that they were in charge of. The Muslims have all this land and all this large structure of society. So it wasn't even on the radar of converting them. Well, that's afterwards, because right now the southern part of Spain is also Muslim. Okay? So yes, ultimately you have to go, but before that you don't even have to do that. The southern part of Spain is Muslim and the northern part of Spain is Christian. And that's the whole battle that's going on. All right. As noted, once the Jews convert, they become conversos, or as they're referred to by the people around them, the Marranos. Marranos means pigs. It's not exactly a delightful label. I'd prefer not. But the conversos, they now become a hidden threat to the larger society. The town folk knew that most of these converts had converted because they were forced to do so. They ceased to be Jews from fear, or at least to gain some advantage of being able to function in society. As Jews, they suffered severe legal disabilities. As conversos, they now had all the same free legal rights that all the other Christians around them came with. And so a Marrano, somebody who converted, in many ways became more hated than the Jews. They were more unpopular. They were an interloper in trade and craft and an economic threat, and probably crypto-Jewish on top of that. This is a group that obviously now given economic opportunities, is very hardworking. When you're poor and you're given a chance to make money, people often work really hard, okay? And so they are not only given opportunity, they are rising in wealth relative to the people around them. And so you've got this mistrust, you've got perceptions of hypocrisy going on, you've got jealousy intensified, and the converts are so numerous and so ubiquitous that the church itself begins to feel threatened. It became impossible to know who was really a Christian, and conversos made their way into the Christian clergy and into the church hierarchy. So even the church began to feel threatened. And in 1449, in Toledo, they experienced the first of a numerous series of major outbreaks of violence, not against Jews, but against the converts to Christianity. They become the threat. It is coming from it's coming from the church, it is coming from Isabella and Ferdinand, and it's coming from the people. So this is a three-pronged attack. There's no alternative. There's no Supreme Court to put a stop to anything. Right? There's no third leg in this process. All right? And so the historical consequences here reverberate for centuries. So from the first half of the 1400s, the 15th century, the Castilian Jewish community is subject to pressures of anti-Jewish and anti-converso propaganda. Jews are hated, the conversos are hated, and the Christians charge that both groups together are conspiring to bring Christianity down. I wish we had the power our enemies give us. I don't know where they think we get this power from, okay? And as a result, they believe that what's happening here is an infiltration from within, as though the conversos are now the agents of the Jews. That's what the belief is now. 1453, you have the fall of Constantinople, and with the Greek Orthodox Church. Okay, Catholic individuals and priests in Castile claim that this all happened due to an international plot. Sound familiar? International plot in which the Jews of Spain were involved, and their goal was to eradicate Christianity and deliver Spain to Islam. Now remember, the southern part of Spain is Muslim. The northern part of Spain is Christian. Christians are now accusing the Jews of trying to help the Muslims win the battle. And so what happens in this world? Riots break out. And any country, when you have a country, what's the one thing you don't want? You don't want riots. What you don't want is unrest. They could not, however, prevent, the riots were so extensive that they couldn't prevent them. It was so extensive they couldn't even punish them adequately. And as a result, by the 1450s, the idea of expelling the Jews from Spain completely begins to be discussed. We can't control the people, so let's get rid of the cause. All right, and so you have this discussion, and it follows the example, as I mentioned before. They're seeing what's going on around them in England and France and the other countries. They see the expulsions, they see what's happening, they see that it works. Okay, everybody uplifted? November 1474, the death of Enrique IV, Isabella, who had been in exile, declares herself to be the Queen of Castile. And her husband, Ferdinand, ascends to the throne with her. The Jewish community, a new king arose, like in Egypt. And the Jewish community has this hope. A new king means, oh, good? Wrong. Okay? The Catholic monarchs have clear plans regarding the Jewish community that are very evidently opposed to what the Jews are hoping for. Both monarchs are driven by a mixture of religious and financial motives, and most importantly, by the desire. Now, again, you've got all these different groups of people living in one area, and a desire to impose a centralizing emotional unity on what is a disparate population. So there's political motives. There's anti-Semitism. There's also times where it's just political. I use the story of Hanukkah, as I see it, is not an anti-Semitic event. It's a political event. All right? Sometimes it's just, that's the politics of it. And then they're also caught up in all the anti-Semitism, that's the thinking that's coming from the past, that's coming in from France, that's coming in from all around as the Christian clergy comes in from all over to emerge in Spain as Muslims are conquered. At a meeting in Cortes in 1476, two important decisions are offered. One was very unsuccessful. The first one is an attempt to restrict money lending with interest, but it didn't work. Let's talk about this money lending, because I think it's an important piece of it. We hear about it all the time. What's going on here? Christianity, and Judaism to some extent as well, based on verses in the Bible, prohibit lending money with interest. Okay? Jews have been less fanatic about it in history, but particularly when all your choices are removed on how you're going to earn money. Where did the Jews get the money to lend? That was always the question in my mind. Where's this coming from? So Christianity allowed the royalty to give Jews money to lend. Because they could give it to Jews, they couldn't give it to Christians. They couldn't lend money to Christians. And so I come over to Gail and I say, here's $10 million. Congratulations. You're going to use it as loans to help people. Oh, by the way, you're going to pay me as the government 20%. All right? So what's the rate you're going to charge? 25 or 30%. So people who want a loan are now paying 25 to 30% on interest, and you as the lender have no option because you've got to pay 20% back. All right? It's a lose-lose. You can understand why the people who took loans in that setting were furious. They're paying 30% on a loan. All right? And at the same time, the Jews are caught in this situation where I don't have a choice. I'm trying to feed my family. All right? And what you see, just to make the point of how important, and again, I'm repeating and I apologize for those in the first class, to make the point of how important those loans and the concerns of the loans were when the Crusaders would go into the towns that they were going through. The very first place that they would go was the Hall of Records and burn the building down, because the Hall of Records contained the records of all the loans. There's no longer any notification that I owe you money. Okay? That was very, very dominant in the thinking. All right, so but the reality of it is when they tried to restrict Jewish loans, who complained? Despite the fact they didn't like the high interest, the larger Christian community, because now they had no access to funds. So their initial reaction was to say, let them lend money. So that didn't work. That was the unsuccessful law they passed. The second one obligated Jews to wear a badge and prohibited them from wearing certain clothing in certain colors. Everyone wore, the Christians wore certain colors, the Muslims wore certain colors, the Jews wore certain colors. It was a way of saying, don't interact with that color. Okay? And by the way, the Muslims did the same thing on this. This apparently was quite common in the time. It should be noted, as I kind of said this before, the Jewish community was willing to do this as well, because they were willing to limit any ostentation in any way. You want to wear clothes that are as drab as possible so that you don't provoke the people around you who hate you. You don't want to in any way stir up jealousies. So the Jewish community kind of went along with this. We'll wear drab clothes, it's all good. I'll stop here again for questions. Yes, sir.
Do we think that the different colors among the Muslims, Jews, and Christians during this time influence the ideas of gangs having their own colors and all sorts of other things along those lines?
So this is the question of causality. Do I think that the colors that were assigned to each of the religions influence gangs? I don't think that I think that it's a third factor. In other words, human beings understood that by wearing certain kinds of things, they were setting themselves apart. That worked here, and it worked for gangs. There is a connection, but I'm not sure I don't think there's a causality. Yes? Well, yes, the answer is yes. They did welcome them initially, although, again, there's a very strong fundamentalist element to the Muslims after about the 12th century, Earlier in times, it was the golden age of Spain. Come in the Almohades and then the Alvarids, who are fundamentalists, think ISIS, think Taliban, for whom the average Muslim is as much the enemy as is the Jew. This is the way you as a Muslim will behave, and we don't tolerate any other kind of Muslim behavior. So yeah, you ended up with a much more fundamentalist approach by that point, and so the Jews weren't necessarily running that direction either. It was better than being killed, but it was pretty tough. All right. During this time, the Christian authorities, the crown, felt a pressing need to visit the newly conquered cities and to essentially to display control. I'm showing up to let you know I'm in charge. Ferdinand and Isabella arrive in Seville, and there they encounter a Dominican friar by the name of Alonso de Hojeda, who stands before them and talks about the fact, I better stay in front of the mic or Melissa will yell at me, and talks about the fact that there's a decline in faith in the city and in the district, and he attributes that decline to the conversos, who are under the influence of the Jews, and the conversos are openly reverting to Judaism and therefore creating an identity crisis. That's how he frames it. In response, they turn to the Pope and they ask him to establish an inquisition. Initially, the Pope rejected the request. He didn't like it because it gave the royal leadership control that he didn't have control of. So again, you've got the political realities of society going on. But ultimately, the pressure grew so great that by 1478, the Pope gives in, and you have the establishment of the Inquisition, whose goal it is to find those who are not really converted, at least in heart. He establishes a court to investigate heresy, to resolve the question on the faith of the conversos, and those who had reverted to Judaism. And the crown and the church both believed that if they could solve this problem, they could solve the entire issue. Everybody will be Christian, everybody will be the same. There'll be no negative influences to achieving the unanimity that we're searching for. They assumed that, fearful of the law, the conversos would disassociate themselves with their Jewish brethren and erase all Jewish memories. If I threaten you with enough, you will just separate yourselves from your past. How do they begin? They begin by issuing an order to the nobility, subjecting them to the authority of the Inquisition. In other words, whether or not you like it, you will not grant protection to the conversos. It's not an option. The crown then demanded that Jews needed to be separated from the conversos. Let's take the Jewish influence out of those who might be seeking to come back. So if your brother converted and he's seeking to come back, you will never see him again. December 27, 1477, I love dates. Dates are so wonderful. That's why we all hated history. An order is issued in Soria to remove the Jewish inhabitants who had their homes among the Christians and to create a Jewish quarter, and after which Jews were forbidden to live in any area where Christians lived. Such orders spread throughout the land, and the edict says the following. It says, "In the laws of our kingdom and according to the holy canons, it is forbidden to the Jews and Moors," meaning the Muslims, "to live among Christians, and they must have separate neighborhoods and separate houses of prayer." So at this point, they're just putting people aside. It speaks of any kind of eliminating the influences and the unpleasantness that arises from Jewish participation in the community. And its goal is ultimately twofold: make life difficult so people will convert, and to raise a barrier between Jews and conversos. The people themselves, this is coming from the government, the people themselves are delighted. All right? You can imagine. The economic opportunities are now there. We don't have to deal with any of this economic competition. And so they're ready to profit from these new arrangements. From the Jewish end of things, it's easy to understand the depth of the shock of what must have been going on. You have all of the limitations on commerce. You have a limited contact not only with the Christian society and those with whom you can do business, but oftentimes your own family. You have Jews moving into these areas, and what happens? The people who owned the homes in those areas to sell them to raise the prices enormously. So a population that has no money is now being called upon as a group to collect money for people to be able to live. Some places this happened peacefully, some places it didn't. The goal of creating separate residential areas, the goal of eliminating the influences that they were hoping to achieve is not achieved. And so we're talking about the 1480s, we're about 10 years prior to the expulsion. There are great tasks that remain for Spain in their minds. The establishment of the Inquisition, the preparation for the military war against the Muslims in southern Spain, and then the purification of Spanish soil on Christian terms only. This is the prelude to what's going to happen with the expulsion, and that's where I'll continue it 2 weeks.
Were Muslims trying to flee as well?
Well, the Muslims, realistically, it was less of a problem because you have to realize they own so much land. For them to flee, they're going home. Right? You know, so yeah, I can't live here, but I can go. Where are the Jews going? Right, right. So either they died or they as a large community, they just went home.
You're probably going to talk about this next week partially, but you said there's a lot of Jews that had freshly converted into Christianity that was on Columbus's ship, and then they ended up going to the New World. I've heard that there was an empire that was right after the Mongolian Empire that is purported to have converted the whole empire to Judaism, and that's the origins of Ashkenaz.
Probably not true. Look, there are all sorts of these kinds of sagas of history that you can't confirm. You know, again, we've heard the American Indians or the 10 Lost Tribes. We've heard all these kinds of stories. The reality of it is I can tell you, the 10 Lost Tribes did one of two things. Either they were carried away and lost their identity, or they simply moved into the southern part of Israel and became part of the other two tribes. They just blended in. They're not the American Indians. They're not, or any other. I can't tell you the exact answer to your particular question of where this particular group came from, et cetera, but I can tell you much of it is myth. You're next.
The Human Genome Project dispelled that theory.
All right, so the comment is the human genome theory dispels that.
They were known as the Khazari.
The Khazari. Well, yeah, that's one, right. Yes.
I guess I'm a little confused. It's probably because I don't really have a sense of the geography of Spain at that time. But we're talking much earlier, 1390, early 1400s, where Jews were isolated. They had all their means of supporting themselves taken away.
Mm-hmm. So the Jews, we're talking about the Jews at this point living, when I'm talking about here, Jews living under Christian control, right? Those living in the Muslim control, probably until the 1480s, probably were less, they were fourth-class status as opposed to fifth-class status.
Well, what you said earlier, like the 1390s, early 1400s, where they couldn't do this, they couldn't do that.
Right.
Isolated. That was 70 years earlier.
Right.
But that was still in Christian Spain, right?
Yes.
Had that subsided?
Obviously, some of these rulings, they wane and wax and wane. And you know, it's just like any other system of law, there are times things are enforced and things that are not. It's just, that's human history. And so I have to imagine who was the ruler? Again, keep in mind, most of northern Spain, although there's a king, it isn't the same as having a country. Most areas are really locally run. And so it depends on who's running it. Okay, so it's where and when. Okay. Thank you. Well, 2 weeks, next week, hope to see you all at Yom Limud. Thank you, thank you. Microphone. Thank you, thank you. Oh, that's a crowd.
You just shut it off. Okay, I was waiting for you to shut it off online. No, I just I have to watch it so I know you're done because it's a delay. Yes, very nice.